Alright YouTube, one of those transitions was done in After Effects, the other one was done in Premiere. Pause this video right now and comment below which you think was which. Take your time. We're going to recreate both of those transitions today. First off, join me inside Premiere. Gosh, that was weird. So I've already dragged in both of the clips that we need. We've got the eye here and the city here. So the first thing we're going to do is choose which part of the eye we want to use. And I really like this bit of the pupil changing shape. So I'm going to use that and I'm going to cut out just before it starts to blink there. So around there, we'll mark an out and we'll drag this and put it onto our sequence. We'll keep the existing settings. Then we're just going to simply scale this eye up so that it matches our sequence to about 225 should do it. Then the first thing that we need to do is start creating a mask around here. So I'm going to go into my opacity parameters here and I'm going to click on create ellipse mask, and then what we can do is simply make this the size and shape that we need it to be. It doesn't have to be 100%, I will say that much, because we're going to cover it with a lot of other elements. So I'm going to change the feather to about 68 and I'm going to change the expansion to around 100, probably somewhere around there. And then I'm going to invert it so that we basically got a hole in the eye. So then I click back on the layer and making sure that I'm at the start on the first frame, I'm going to track the mask to the movement of the eye. I'm quite happy with that, so I think I'm going to leave that as it is. So I'm going to take the eye layer, move it up onto the next track, and then I'm going to bring in the city. And I'm going to drop the city underneath the eye. Then I'm going to scale it up so that it sits nicely behind the eye. And I'm going to add in camera blur, because I don't want it to be that crisp. I also don't want it to be as blurred as it is now. So I'm going to drop that camera blur to about 2, and that's looking okay. Now, next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hold Alt and drag the eye up to the top so that I'm basically duplicating the eye layer. So this layer on track 3 is exactly the same as the layer on track 2. Then I'm going to unclick inverted here so that that's unchecked. But then we need to make some adjustments to the mask of this one. So I can see, so basically you can see that we're getting this sort of gap here where we're seeing the city layer behind it. So we need to change our mask feather probably to around 30. And then I think we probably need to change the expansion about there. And then I'm going to drop the opacity of this layer so that we can see the city reflected in the eye. So probably around 97. That looks pretty good for now. We might make some adjustments to that later on. Next thing I'm going to do is, we don't need the rest of the city there, so let's get rid of that. But I'm now going to duplicate the city and put it back on top. And what I'm going to do with this is create a mask to the iris, because basically I want it to comp a little bit better than it is. I like the fact that we can see it, but it doesn't look too much like a reflection at the moment. And basically if we turn this layer off, you can see we lose a lot of the city here. It's looking good in the actual pupil, but in the iris we're not getting as much of it as I'd like. So what I'm going to do is create a mask around the iris. Again, this doesn't have to be 100% because we're going to whack the feather up probably to about 130. We're going to take the expansion down probably to around -12 to get that to fit a little better. I'm going to take the opacity down quite a bit. I'm going to change the blending mode to soft light. you can see we've just brought a little bit of the city back into the iris there. So it just makes it a little bit more believable as a reflection. So far, this is what we've got. So we've got the pupil contracting and we've got the reflection of the city in the eye, which I'm liking. So the next thing I'm going to do is select all of these layers, right click and nest them, and I'm going to call this nest eye base, because this is now going to serve as the base layer for everything else that we're going to do. I'm going to lift this up and I'm going to go into it, and I'm going to select the city and I'm going to copy and paste it into our main sequence. I'm going to extend this out, and I think let's figure out where we want our zoom to start. When do we want to start really zooming into the eye? I think probably around here. So I'm going to get rid of all of the city before that because we don't need it. Now that we've nested this, we can make all of our scale and position adjustments within one layer rather than trying to use all 4 layers that we had before. So I want to go into the first frame. I'm going to hit scale and position. I'm going to go forward to about 110, and I want to do a slow zoom in at that point, and then over the next second I want to zoom in all the way. So at that point we're probably going to be at about 1,000, something like that, and let's change the position so that we're right in the center of the eye. Then here I want it to have done a slow scale up, so I'm going to change that to about 110, and I'm going to change the position so that it's a bit more centered. Then from probably around halfway through the zoom, we need to lower the opacity of this layer to, let's line it up with these keyframes here so that by the time we get to there we've hit 0. Then the next thing I'm going to do is go back to this keyframe here, and we're going to put another mask on this eye base layer here. Now what this mask is going to do is, rather than this whole layer just fading out, which would be fine, we're going to make it so that the center of the eye, the iris, starts to essentially fade out before everything else. So I'm going to put a feather on that, probably around there, and we're going to invert it. And then in order to make this iris part of the eye slowly disappear, what we're going to do is we're going to keyframe the expansion. So as the scale starts, we want the whole thing to be there. So we're going to take it all the way down to about there, which is around 810. And then at this point, I'm going to take this up to probably around 200. And what that should do is, as we move through, there you can see the center of the eye starts to disappear here, but the outsides are still there, so that it just seems a little bit more plausible that we're zooming into the eye. But there's a bit of a problem, because when we get to this point of the eye disappearing, you can see that the city isn't big enough to fill frame. So what we need to do with the city is, just before we start to see those black bars, which is about there, we're going to hit the scale of the city, and I want it to be 225 because I know that that fills frame. And then what we're going to do is, at the end of the animation of the eye going off, which is probably about there, I want the city to be about probably 240-ish, something like that. Because the other thing we want to do is try and make sure that the city, the reflection of the city, which is this bit here, matches up with the city underneath it. Now, even though we are going to put some distortion on the city, we still need the city in this layer to match up with the city in this layer as much as possible. So that's actually looking all right. Now, so as I mentioned, we're going to add some distortion to the city. So the first thing we're going to do is go down here into Distort, and we're going to add lens distortion. And we're going to use these keyframes up here, which is our scale keyframes, as a bit of a guide as to how much we want to do. So the first thing we're going to do is change our curvature. We want our curvature to be all the way down at -100. Let's turn off the eye base layer so that we can see what we're doing. So look, click that on and off. So that's just giving it some distortion. What I want to do is try as much as possible to make it look like we are actually going through the eye. Because what a lot of these transitions do is you sort of just like the eye just slowly fades away and then you're in the next layer. But I want this as much as possible to make it look like we're actually bursting through the eye. And so if we give this city layer a bit of distortion, hopefully that will help achieve that effect. So when we know that the eye has completely disappeared, I want it to be at 0. Make sure those are keyframed. So I'm going to take that down to -100 at that point. So you can see at the start of when the eyes will start to disappear, we're fully distorted, and then the distortion slowly decreases throughout. What I want to try and do is make that a little bit smoother. So I'm going to go into our graph here and just select these keyframes. And I'm going to have it start a bit faster. And I'm going to have that distortion slow down gradually. So here you can see we've created a ramp of it starting a bit faster and slowing down towards the second keyframe. So the next effect that I want to add to make it look like we're going through the eye is a turbulent displace. So let's take that and drop that onto the city. Let's click those back up so that we can see what we're going to get here. So I'm going to use these keyframes as a guide again. So I'm going to change my displacement here to bulge. I know I want my amount to be around 50, so I'm going to keyframe that there. And I'm also going to change the size. I'm going to keyframe it and take it up to probably around 130. And then we're going to go over to our next keyframe. But the thing is, I don't want this turbulent displacement to last as long, so I'm going to probably go to around here, and then I'm going to drop the amount down to 0, and I'm going to drop the size down to, I'm going to try and do 0, but it will probably go to 2. Now, the thing is, if you were to drop the amount down to 0, you wouldn't be able to see the effect at all. But the reason I'm dropping the size as well is because it makes it a slightly smoother transition. So the next thing we need to do, using these keyframes as a guide, is turn our camera blur all the way down so that by the time we get through to the city, there's no camera blur on it at all. So let's turn our eye base on and play this back and see what we get. Okay, that's looking pretty cool already. The next thing we need to do in order to make this a little bit more believable is we're going to add some directional blur to it as we zoom. So I've already created this adjustment layer. If you don't know how to create an adjustment layer, you can go down to this little icon here, click on it and choose adjustment layer. It will create an adjustment layer the size of your sequence. So I'm going to grab this, bring it down. I don't need all of this malarkey over here, so let's get rid of that. Now, as we start our zoom, we want our adjustment layer to have some directional blur on it. So I'm going to grab directional blur from over there, put it on, and we're going to start some keyframing of the blur length. So I know that as the zoom starts and to about here, we want our blur length to be high so that we're getting a decent amount of blur as the movement starts. And then by the end of the zoom around here, so towards the end of the transition, we want the blur length to go back to 0. Let's just see with the blur on what direction we want it to be. There you go, that's looking pretty cool. So let's save and render and play this back. Now that's already looking pretty cool, but there's a couple more things that I want to do just to finish it off. Now the first thing we're going to do is, I've just realised I don't need the rest of this, so let's get rid of that. I am going to take all of these layers and make them into a new nest, and we're going to call this eye null. And what I want to do is, at the point where the transition is about just about to go from the eye to the city, I want to give it a sort of impact wobble, again as if travelling through the eye has made the camera shake a little bit. So let's find the right moment. I reckon probably about there is where we want there to be some camera shake. So I'm going to click on scale and rotation to bring up those parameters. I'm going to rotate by 2 degrees positive. Then I'm going to scale that up to get rid of those black corners. Then I'm going to go 2 more frames and go -2. Keep the scale the same, go another 2 frames, change the rotation to 0, and the scale back to 100. And let's see what we've got. Nice. I'm really pleased with that. Okay, I think the final thing to do, drop on an adjustment layer, go over to here, grab Lumetri color, and we're just going to do just a quick grade just to give it a bit of a look. I'm quite a fan of the Fuji Turner looks. Drop the intensity probably down to about 75%, then go into basic correction, drop the saturation down a little bit, drop the contrast down a little bit, maybe bring the blacks up a touch. Okay, I think this might be our final result. Let's have a look. Pretty cool. So that was Premiere. Let's jump inside After Effects, where personally I think you get better results because you've got access to better effects. Now, I'm going to assume that a lot of people know the basics of After Effects for the sake of this tutorial, so I'll be using a lot of shortcuts that you won't see come up on screen because I'm using my Elgato Stream Deck or my Monogram Creative Console. But if you've got any questions about those shortcuts or the basics, or indeed those 2 devices, then let me know in the comments. I try to answer as many comments as I can. So, join me inside After Effects. Oh man, not again. So, as before, the first thing we need to do is drag our eye into our comp, scale it up so that it fills the comp, and then we're going to, as before, mask and track the iris. So we're going to go up here, grab our ellipse tool, and do a quick mask around the eye. We can adjust. I'm going to turn this on to none so that we can see what we're working with. I'm going to adjust the mask. Again, same as in Premiere, this doesn't need to be exact, but we can get it pretty close, and that should do the trick. Then let's turn this to subtract so that we can see what we're working with. I'm going to feather this and change the expansion, and then we're going to right click. Make sure you're on the first frame when you do this and click track mask, and that will bring up your tracker window on the right hand side of your screen. Play around with it and see what works best for you, but I'm going to go with position, scale and rotation for this one and see what that gives us. So let's click play and see what we get. Do you know what? That doesn't look bad. What I'm going to do to improve it a little bit more is click on our own mask expansion, and as we go through, I'm just going to see there, I can see that we need to change ours probably to around there, and then as we go through, do you know what? The rest of it looks okay. So we can leave that for the moment. Bring in our city behind it. Scale that up and add our blur as we did before. The blur in After Effects works differently to the way it does in Premiere. So whereas before I think we had about 2 in Premiere, here we want to have around 5. Looks pretty good, just so that it's not as sharp, because a reflection wouldn't be as sharp. Now it's looking all right, but the problem is when the eye moves, the city doesn't move with it. In Premiere, as far as I know, there's nothing you can do about that, but in After Effects there is. What we want to do is again go to our start point here, and we are going to go back into our tracker, and we're going to go track motion. We're going to zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to take our track point and put it on this area. So what you want when you're tracking is you want an area of high contrast. So the difference between this white spot and the black of the pupil is probably going to be pretty good. So let's click play and see what we get. Do you know what? That looks to be okay. So let's go new null object, and then we're going to click on edit target and make sure that we're applying all of this tracking data to our null, and click OK, and then click apply, and then we'll click OK. And what that does is it takes all of that tracking data and applies it to this null, and then we take the city and we parent the city to the null, and then when we scrub through, when the eye moves, the city moves with it. Now I know that I don't need the rest of the city after this frame, so let's trim that out there. We can also trim out the null there, just helps to keep it all a bit cleaner. And then we need to do the same as before and duplicate the eye, take it onto the top, then take our mask and hit add so that we're bringing the pupil back in. And then we need to change the mask feather and the expansion to make sure that we're not getting this gap here. So let's unclick on the expansion and take that up until we've got rid of that gap there. That's looking pretty good. And to be safe, let's give ourselves a little bit more of a feather, and then we'll drop the opacity until we can see the city, until we think that's looking pretty good. So I'm thinking around between 85 and 90 is probably pretty good. Let's play this back and see what we've got. Okay, I'm pretty pleased with that so far. Let's take all of these layers and pre-comp them, and we'll call this eye base as we did before. We'll copy our city, pop it beneath, and we'll do the same as we did before. Take that all the way to the end, and we know that at around 2 seconds, 1.5 seconds is where we want it to start zooming in, so we don't need this city layer until around then, so we'll trim it to there, and then we can start to work with the scale and position of the eye base layer. So let's go to the start, hit S to bring up our scale parameters, hit Shift P to also bring up our position simultaneously, click on our stopwatch there. Around here we want it to be at around 110, I think it was before, and then around here we want it to be absolutely massive around there, and we want our position to be around there so that it looks like we're zooming in. Let's go to 110 here. Let's try and center this up a little bit as much as we can without it giving us black bars top and bottom. Now what I don't like, as you can see, if we go onto these position keyframes here, we've got a slight Bezier curve. So what I'm going to do is right click those, go keyframe interpolation, and change those to linear so that it moves in a straight line to this keyframe and then in a straight line to that keyframe. And then what we want to do is about halfway through this transition, we want to start lowering the opacity of this. So we'll go T to bring up our opacity, hit U to bring up our other keyframes, drop it down to 0 there, and then you can see the city is starting to appear behind it. But what I also want to do is what we did last time, which is start to mask out the iris of the eye as we start to zoom in. So let's create a mask on this layer by clicking our ellipse tool up top. And again, this doesn't need to be 100%, so we can do it roughly. I'm going to click none so that I can see what I'm working with. That's looking pretty cool. Let's hit MM to bring up all of our mask parameters. And as per usual, we want to give that a feather. And from about this point, we want to change the mask expansion as we did before. So around here, we want it to have completely disappeared. So let's go back to our first keyframe and we want to change it to subtract. But we want to be able to see it all at this point. So we know we need to drop it all the way down. Probably around there is good. And then at this point, we want it to have completely gone. So it's probably going to be around 60, I would say. Let's just scrub through quickly and see what we get. Very cool. Okay, next step is to fix the city behind, because again, we've got all of this area which we don't want to see. So let's bring up our scale, and we know from before that we want it to be about 225 at this point. So let's hit our stopwatch and it's going to be 225, and then at this point we want it to keep scaling in a little bit so that it carries on that zoom effect, probably to around 240. Now the next thing we need to do is also turn off our camera blur on here, so that as we go through the eye, the camera blur reduces. So we'll hit our stopwatch up here, use these keyframes as a guide. We know that that's the end of the transition, so we can whack that down to 0 so that it's nice and crisp by the time we get to the end of the transition. So let's play this back and see what we've got. Very cool. Next step, let's start to put some distortion on the city. So the first effect I'm going to look for is called bulge. We'll drag that on. And what we want to do is, again, we're going to use these keyframes here as a guide. We want to change the horizontal radius, the vertical radius, the bulge height, and the taper radius. The bulge center will stay the same because it will just be in the center. We want the horizontal radius to start off absolutely massive so that it's basically, you can see the guide here. So we want it to be the entire image basically. So we're going to go with that, and the taper radius, which basically acts similarly to a feather, we're going to take all the way up, and then a bit after it's finished, you can see the effect that it's having here. We don't want that to end as soon as the zoom ends. We want it to end a little bit after. So I'm going to go to around here, and I'm going to take these all down to 0. So as I played that back, I realised I wanted to give it a little bit more of a bulge. So I want it to start big, go small, and then get big again, and then go small again. So pretty pleased with that. The next effect that we're going to put on there is called CC Lens. So let's grab that, drag it over onto the city, and toggle this down so that we can see what we're working with. Now we want to change the size and the convergence. So again, we're going to use these keyframes up above here as a guide. Now obviously that looks awful. But if we take the size to about 140-ish, let's see what that gives us as we zoom through. So now you can see we're getting this distortion as if we're stretching at the edge of frame, which is super cool. So then what we want to do is around the same time, probably a little bit later, just to let that effect die down a little bit later, is drag this all the way up to 500 so that we're getting nothing, and the convergence we want to take all the way down to -200 so that we're not seeing that effect anymore. Let's play that back and see what we get. So as I played that back, I realised I didn't like it very much, so I've adjusted some of the parameters on the bulge and the CC lens. With the CC lens, I've dragged it out so that it lasts longer, and with the bulge, I kept the taper radius a bit higher so that it's a bit of a smoother transition to that effect fading out. And I'm pretty happy with this now. It's just a bit more subtle, and I think that's working really well. So the next thing we need to do is add our blur. So new, adjustment layer, and at this point as the zoom starts. Now the reason I'm not using the motion blur in After Effects is because I feel like with using the direction blur, I have a bit more control over what I want it to look like. So I'm going to add in our direction blur. And we know that at around that point there, we want it to be pretty high. So we want our blur length to be pretty high at this point so that we're getting some nice blur as the motion starts. And then by this point, we want it to be fading out again. So we'll just click 0. Let's play this back and see what we get. That's cool. It's really starting to look like we're going through the eye. So now let's add in our camera shake. What we want to do is create a new null object. Select everything that we've got so far, use our pickwick to parent everything to the null, and as we get to about here is when I want the camera shake to come in. So let's hit S, Shift R to bring up our scale and rotation parameters simultaneously. Then we'll go forward 2 frames, scale it up to about 110, I think it was. Change our rotation to -2, go forward 2 frames, change it to +2, make sure our scale stays the same, forward another 2 frames, change it to 0, scale to 100. Let's play this back and see what we've got. Very cool. And as before, final thing, let's add in a new adjustment layer, whack on Lumetri color, and we'll add on a similar grade. So we're trying to make these as close to each other as we can. So let's drop that to 75 as we did before. Let's go into basic correction. I think we dropped that to about 70. Then we turn the blacks up a little bit. Right, this should be our final result. Let's play it back and see what we've got. Pretty cool. So that was both versions. Now looking back on them, I would probably have used more easy ease on some of the parameters like scale and position just to make the transition a bit smoother, but as I was doing the tutorial, I was panicking because I wanted to make it good for you guys. Now to answer the question, at the beginning, the first transition was done in Premiere and the second one was done in After Effects, and on the split screen, on the left it was Premiere and on the right it was After Effects. So, did you get it right? If you want to continue learning more stuff in Premiere, you can click on this tutorial right here. Hope to see you in the next one. Peace!